Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Today we are finishing up journal collection number 46, dating from the year 1855, and Emerson was 52 years old. And with that said, I'll go ahead and read the next entry. I hold that a wise man will write nothing but that which is known only to himself, and that he will not produce his truth until it is imperatively demanded by the exigencies of the conversation which has arrived at that point. So is the shrine and pedestal ready, so he produces his statue, and it fills the eye. The English are stupid because they reserve their strength. The Lowells ripen slowly. Hurrying America makes out of the little vanities its great men, as now the three leading men in America are of a small sort, who never saw a grander arch than their own eyebrow, never saw the sky of a principle which made them modest and contemners of themselves. Yet Washington, Adams, Quincy, Franklin, I would willingly adorn my hall with, and I will have daguerres of Alcott, Channing, and Thoreau. A man of thought is willing to die, willing to live, I suppose because he has seen the thread on which the beads are strung, and perceived that it reaches up and down, existing quite independently of the present illusions. A man of affairs is afraid to die, is pestered with terrors, because he has not this vision, yet the first cannot explain it to the second. Greenough thinks civility grew fast in East and Southern Europe because the climate allowed them leisure to occupy themselves about matters of general and lasting import. Quote, the leisure which nature gave them we may have if we belong to our climate and do not make our civilization merely a colossal one. Quote, for not only in servitude is man robbed of half his life, without a state and an immediate fatherland, the noblest man is little worth. With them, even the simple can do much. Niebuhr, Letters, Volume 3, page 129. 'Tis a measure of culture, the number of things taken for granted. Soddy. Wretch is one of those disconsolate preachers. Please don't put a dismal picture on the wall. David Scott tinged his canvas with sable, but depth of intellect relieves even the ink of crime with a fringe of light, as in Napoleon. Quote, a Sydney of tranquil principles, Evelyn. Mythology is no man's work. The illusion of a firm earth is more useful and more composing than any narcotic. Macaulay. No person ever knew so much that was so little to the purpose. Quote, immensi tremor oceani, on de Ruyter's monument at Amsterdam. Books are the destruction of literature. Quote, the golden age of the Greek literature was that in which no book grew under the stylus or the calamus, but these merely served as aids, and not probably until after the lapse of centuries, to the precarious tradition of the nation and the overladen memory of the poetical singers and narrators. Niebuhr, Letters, Volume 3, page 217. Sleepy Hollow. Ellery Channing says, they will lay out the grounds in the way of a dentist. A dentist wants a good tooth, but it must be a false tooth. Trees should be the only ornaments. Let the grounds well alone, or aim only at the purgation of superfluities. Quote, kings for such a tomb would wish to die, etc. Schiller said, quote, thoughtest thou that this infinite round is the sepulchre of thine ancestors, that the wind brings thee, that the perfumes of the lindens bring, perhaps, the spent force of Arminius to thy nostril, that thou and the refreshing fountain, perhaps, tasteth the balsamed bones of our great Henry? Soddy, cheerfulness. In every cottage I heard complaint. In every middle-class house I heard of bad servants. Quote, where there is no gaiety and no enjoyment of life, there can be no vigor in art, in speech, or thought, says Niebuhr. A man is not to aim at innocence any more than he is to aim at hair, but he is to keep it. It is inestimable as a basis or accompaniment of his ability, but nothing alone. Niebuhr's letter to Savigny on his discovery of the survival of the Roman jugerum and the Italian pezza is good quetelism again. Quote, the whole system of the Roman weights and measures exhibits striking indications of a mathematical basis. Their mile of 1,000 paces bears an evident relation to a degree of the meridian, and in all probability the latter determined the length of the pace in the foot, which again determined on the one hand the land measure, and on the other the measure of capacity. For the amphora was a cubic foot, Letters, Volume 3, page 165. Thus here again we have in a census of civil men the fair share of Eulers and Monges and Lagranges appearing. 'Tis the air that is geometrical, and he who breathes it deeply begins at once to compute and measure. So it seems probable that the Phoenicians had the secret of the magnet which is called lapis Heraclesis, and that Hercules' golden cup in which he sailed the sea was a mariner's compass. Quote, Paris, that mass of iron deposited on the banks of the Seine, says Babinet, complaining of the disturbance of his delicate magnets. Quote, no two terrestrial meridians can be found alike any more than two oak leaves, says Babinet. May 20th. Last week, in the race ground at Cambridge, a man from New York named Grindal ran 10 miles in 57 minutes and some odd seconds. His competitor was Stetson, who was only 21 seconds behind him. You may chide sculpture or drawing, if you will, as you may rail at orchards and cornfields, but I find the grand style in sculpture as admonitory and provoking to good life as Marcus Antoninus. I was in the Athenaeum and looked at the Apollo and saw that he did not drink much port wine. The Cid boasted that he never obtained his swords by barter or trade, but won them in fight. The life is sacred in each house. That did not come into the house by any door, but was born into it. Series and degree. Metamorphosis is intelligible only on the doctrine that the world repeats world. In swimming world it swims. In creeping world creeps. In flying world it flies. Come up to higher plane still, act passes into thought, and flies with finer wing. The year. There is no flower so sweet as the four-petaled flower, which science much neglects. One gray petal it has, one green, one red, and one white. June. A scholar is a man with this inconvenience, that when you ask him his opinion of any matter, he must go home and look up his manuscripts to know. How strange, said Choate, all the English to this day love or hate Charles Fox so much that they cannot understand the history of Greece. Osmunda regalis. And chiefly that tall fern, so stately of the Queen Osmunda, named plant lovelier in its own retired abode, on Grasmere's beach than Naiad by the side of the Grecian brook, or Lady of the Mere, soul sitting by the shores of old romance. Wordsworth. July. Morals. 'Tis wonderful where the moral influences come from, since no man is a moralist. 'Tis like the generation of the atmosphere, which is a secret. Coleridge is one of those who save England from the reproach of no longer possessing in the land the appreciation of what highest wit the land has yielded, as Shakespeare, Spenser, Herbert, etc. But for Coleridge and a lurking, taciturn, or rarely speaking minority, One would say that in Germany and in America is the best mind of England rightly respected. And that sure is the sign of a national decay, when the Brahmins can no longer read and understand the Brahminical science and philosophy. Louis Napoleon, the present emperor, is a plucky fellow who writes spirited terms for his General Pelsier to offer the Russians, and bolder far than the English would have dictated, he means to teach them how robbers rob. Trifles. Lone women, readers, etc., wish to live with good housekeepers, and never learn that good housekeepers cordially hate anybody who does not dine at the family hour. Woman. I think it impossible to separate their education and interest. The policy of defending their property is good, and if the women demand votes, offices, and political equality, as an elder and eldress are of equal power in the Shaker families, refuse it not. 'Tis very cheap wit that finds it so funny. Certainly all my points would be sooner carried in the state if women voted. And the new movement is only a tide shared by the spirits of man and woman, and you may proceed in a faith that, whatever the woman's heart is prompted to desire, the man's mind is simultaneously prompted to execute. Women, more than all, are the element and kingdom of illusion. There is unbelief in a cigar, in wine, in all luxury. The poet doubts his access to the grand sources of inspiration, doubts the continuance of the supplies, and steals to these shabby pots. Quote, "De Greeks be goads, de Greeks be goads," said Fuseli, striding up and down among the Elgin marbles. What adoptive arms their English genius has, hospitable to ability from every land. Fuseli, Kneller, Romilly, Ricardo, Schomburg, Asser, Handel, Herschel. The Church is an institution of God. Yes, but are not wit and wise men and good judgment whether a thing be so or no, also institutions of God and older than the other? Never to assume an obscure cause, when an obvious one exists, as a rule of the mind. It is therefore a little violent, is it not, to contradict the universal traditions of mankind in regard to the eastern origin of nations, by assuming independent creation of a several race for each country. Sleepy Hollow. The blazing evidence of immortality is our dissatisfaction with any other solution. All great natures love stability. Our fear of death is like our fear that summer will be short, but when we have had our swing of pleasure, our fill of fruit, and our swelter of heat, we say we have had our day, and the rest of brain and affection please. Quote, "When we pronounce the name of man, we pronounce the belief of immortality." Lieber. Quote, "Death takes us away from ill things, not from good." Superlative. 'Twas a great discovery to me that when a lady says, "She shall die," she means take a nap. I want a horse that will run all day like a wolf. Aristocracy. First come, first served. There is no rich man like the self-reliant. This is royalty. He walks in a long street. Once for all he has abdicated second thoughts, and asks no leave of others' eyes, and makes lanes and alleys palatial. What talent had this second Charles, that he could hold his place among the Wrens, Hookes, Newtons, Flamsteeds, Halleys, Bentleys, Pettys, Coventrys that clustered in his "royal society," and atoned for the harpies and dragons and all unclean beasts which masqueraded in titles around him. Manners, the manners of power, sense enough to see his advantage, and manners up to it. That is his cheap secret, and a boundless subserviency corresponding in the people. Just what happens in every two persons who meet any affair. Alcott. I was struck with the late superiority he showed. The interlocutors were all better than he. He seemed childish and helpless, not apprehending or answering their remarks aright, they masters of their weapons. But by and by, when he got upon a thought, like an Indian seizing by the mane and mounting a wild horse of the desert, he overrode them all, and showed such mastery, and took up time and nature like a boy's marble in his hand, as to vindicate himself. Thought is identical, the oceanic one, which flows hither and thither, and sees that all are its offspring. It coins itself indifferently into house or inhabitant, into plants or man or fish or oak or grain of sand. All are reconvertible into it. Every atom is saturated with it, and will celebrate in its destiny the same laws. Everything, by being, comes to see and to know. The work is eyes, and the artist informs himself in forming matter. England. I wish they had made no exception to their dislike of adventurers in the recent reception of the Emperor Louis Napoleon. The pride and traditions of the aristocracy and of the commons, at the moment when they might have rallied to the side of purest virtue, were ingloriously forgotten. It seems impossible to hold governments to the belief that the use of dishonest partnerships is as ruinous for nations as for private men. Where were the very Romae? Where was Cromwell? Where the Elizabeth Tudors and Blakes and Sandwiches, Talbots of Shrewsbury? Where the Nelsons and Collingwoods and Wellingtons when the haughty aristocracy and the haughty commons of London cringed like a Neapolitan populace before this impudent thief? The capture of London by French cuirassiers or by Russian Cossacks had not been such a defeat. Let an English gentleman walk very modestly henceforward. Nature is a swamp, on whose purlieus we see prismatic dewdrops, but her interiors are terrific. King Alfred. Quote, good fortune accompanied him in all things like a gift from God. Good fortune is another name for perception and goodwill. What fortune can compare with intellect? Does the early history of each tribe show the permanent bias of the tribe, which is then lost or masked in complex relations, as the tribe spreads and pronounces itself in colonies, commerce, codes, arts, letters? The first simple tendency. The early history shows it as the musician plays the air, which he proceeds to conceal in a tempest of variations. Alcott thought he had not a lecture or a book, but was himself an influence. He justified himself by naming or letting you name an ideal assembly of Socrates, Zoroaster, Pythagoras, Behmen, Swedenborg, and if such were bodily present, he should not be shamed, but would be free of that company. I hinted that all these were exact persons, severe with themselves, and could formulate something. Could he formulate his dogma? I proposed to lock him up in prison so that he might find out what was his memory, what fancy, what instinct, what analysis. A horse doctor could give a prescription to cure a horse's heel. Had he no recipe for a bad memory or a sick angel? To all which he replied that he must have a scribe to report his thoughts, which now escaped him. I dread autobiography, which usurps the largest part, sometimes the whole of the discourse of very worthy persons whom I know. Science. He erects himself into a barrier. The savant is not willing to report nature, to stand by report, but must report nature Cuvierized or Blainvilleized, nature Owenized or Agassized, etc., which modification diminishes the attraction of the thing in a fatal manner. Pyramids and catacombs are not built by whim, but by ideas. They grew up from the credence of the builder as our telegraphs and our railroads from ours. A depression of spirits in a nation as well as in an individual develops the germs of a plague. Quote, poetry among the Scandinavians was inscribed on small quadrangular staves, which were conveniently adapted for the reception of a verse or stanza each face containing a line. Amongst us, therefore, a verse and a stave are still synonymous. Edinburgh Review. The Scandinavian law said that the unguarded open field, was under God's lock with heaven for its roof, though but for the hedge for its wall. The wedding formula of the English liturgy is Saxon. The Trigdamal, or assurance of truce, highly poetical. Henry Thoreau asks, fairly enough, when is it that the man is to begin to provide for himself? Well, yes, of course, today if ever. But I think some men are born Capuchins. Capuchins, too, are in the nature of things, and this is the best, or abbot of the order. He should have for his arms the cyclamen, which the Italians called cappuccino. I think genius has a preemption, an antecedent or signorial right in lands and chattels. Just as man is conscious of the law of vegetable and animal nature, so he is aware of an intellect which overhangs his consciousness like a sky. Of degree above degree, and heaven within heaven, number is lost in it. Millions of observers could not suffice to write its first law. Yet it seemed to him, the ideal man, as if gladly he would dedicate himself to such a God, be a faker of the intellect, fast and pray, spend and be spent, wear its colors, wear the infirmities, were it pallor, sterility, celibacy, poverty, insignificance, were these the livery of its troop, as the smith wears his apron and the collier his smutted face, honest infirmities, honorable scars, so that he be rewarded by conquest of principles, or by being purified and admitted into the immortalities, mount and ride on the back of these thoughts, steeds which course forever the ethereal plains. Time was nothing. He had no hurry. Time was well lavished, were its centuries and cycles, in these surveys. It seemed as if the very sentences he wrote, a few sentences after summers of contemplation, shone again with all the suns which had gone to contribute to his knowing. Few were the lords he could reckon. Memory and imagination and perception, he did not know more for living long. Abandon yourself, he said, to the leading when the leader comes. This was the sum of wisdom and duty. Shake off from your shoes the dust of Europe and Asia, the rotten religions and personalities of nations. Act from your heart, where the wise temperate guidance is instantly born. Perception, memory, imagination, metamorphosis, the flowing and the melioration or ascent. Then, as Dionysius described the orders of celestial angels, so the degrees of intellect are an organic fact, and indeed it is these which give birth to mythology. It is true, is it not, that the intellectual man is stronger than the robust animal man, for he husbands his strength and endures. Yet the puppies fight well, said Wellington of the overfine cultivated young Londoners. Henry Thoreau notices that Franklin and Richardson of Arctic expeditions outlived their robuster comrades by more intellect. Fremont did the same. This is the tough tannin that cures the fiber when Irish and Dutch are killed by fever and toil. Aunt Mary, if you praised a lady warmly, would stop you short. Is it a colored woman of whom you were speaking? When Mrs. Brown ran into any enthusiasms on Italian patriots, etc., Miss Brown, how's your cat? When she had once bowed to Goodnow and his wife at the Lyceum, not quite knowing who they were, Goodnow had offended her when she boarded with them, she afterwards went up to him and said, I did not know who you were, or should never have bowed to you. The verses I had composed on Lady Valtorte, walking home one morning from Les Coches, remained in my memory floating in indistinct fragments for some weeks, during which time I was too busy about other things to write them down. From time to time I took a look, as it were, into my memory, to see if they were still there. At last I copied them out, etc. Moore's Diary. Quetelettism. If the picture is good, who cares who made it? Better, of course, it should be the work of a man in the next street than of Landseer. And the authorship of a good sentence, whether Vedas or Hermes or Chaldean oracle or Jack Straw, is totally a trifle for pedants to discuss. Only imports it that man should be wise, apparent images of unapparent gods, and Montaigne's old remark that if we can fix it in Homer, but what do you know of Homer? Dead man and dead man, is it the letters of one name and the letters of another name? The first lesson of history is the good of evil. Good is a good doctor, but bad is a better. Suggestiveness. Everything has two handles, or, like a seed, two nodes, one of which shoots down as rootlet and one upwards as tree. Every thought is made poetical by converting it from a particular into a general proposition. As there is no flower or weed so low or lonely but is strictly related to its botanic family, so no thought is solitary, but will slowly disclose its root in a law of the mind. Heaven is the exercise of the faculties, the added sense of power. To the architect it is architecture, to the broker it is money, to the orator it is force of statement and rule of his audience. To the savant it is discovery of the extension of his principle, a key to new facts, new dominion of nature. I cannot see the fault of a facade or of a temple. I am so much occupied and pleased with beautiful details. So I cannot remember and require the ideal integrity of man. I am so captivated with my friends. They told the children that if they count 1,000 stars, they would fall down dead. And you will, but it is because details are fatal to the integral life. August. Editor's note. During August, Mr. Emerson went to Amherst, Massachusetts, on the invitation of the students of the college to deliver an address. On the following pages of the journal are many notes of material, much from earlier journals, for this occasion, a few of which here are given. For Amherst. Could you show the riches of the poor? Could you shame the vain? Could you make them think common daylight was worth something? The distinction of thought is an aristocratic distinction. Instead of dealing with raw materials, it deals with methods. And it only obtains real progression. Until we have intellectual property in a thing, we have no right property. As to the first coming and finding, there were comers and finders before you, already in occupation when you came. There was the bird, and the beaver, and the buffalo, and the fox. But there were meliorations these could not reach, obstructions they could not surmount. Second part, which Cambridge plays at its own feasts. Interest of the class of reform dependent on their representing an unexplained thought, not spent volcanoes. What have we to do with reading that ends in reading? They, the true philosophers, called ideas gods. They were worshippers. They dared not contravene with knacks and talents the divinity which they recognized in genius. When the Greeks in the Iliad perceived that the gods mingled in the fray, they drew off. Moore's book is good reading through all the volumes for anyone who wishes to know English society. Moore himself, on his very conditioned and rather low platform of perfectly accepting English conventions without one breath of noble rebellion, is manly and resolute. He is sure to face every crisis and opponent, and do what society think the honorable thing. His affections are, however, very pale and permitted, and whatever is said about his father or his mother, or even his wife and child, is said to be overheard. It is a little transparent, through all his account of his high friends, that he is a kept poet, however they please to phrase it. If he is kept, so also are all the proprieties kept on their part at their peril. but the same web weaves itself in all times and countries, however the fashions and names vary. The new professions. The phrenologist and railroad man, the landscape gardener, the lecturer, the sorcerer, rapper, mesmerizer, medium, the daguerreotypist, proposed, the naturalist and the social undertaker. Jean Paul asked, did he not, for a woman who should see nature as a whole and not in parts. Sismondi spent 8 hours a day for 20 years on his histories, but somebody meanwhile was spending the same time to purpose. The assiduity is the valuable fact. In thought 'tis of more note. You laugh at the monotones, at the men of one idea. But if we look nearly at heroes, we find the same poverty, and perhaps it is not poverty, but a fruitful law. Thus Demosthenes, the electrical head in the most electrical city, all his speeches, 'tis said, have one inspiration, which is self-reliance, and the like doctrine is the genius and guiding star of Chatham's eloquence. And indeed, if one reduce the doctrine of Zeno and the Stoic sect, who were the pre-Christians, the religions of the Greek and Roman states, you will find that not many thoughts, but a few thoughts, one thought perhaps, self-reliance. Christianity insisted on the obverse of the medal, on love, but not on any variety or wealth of thoughts. And the justification of this is in the nature of thought. Thought is the most elastic of things, and a whole nation has subsisted on one book, as the Jews on their Pentateuch, the Muslim on their Koran, the Hindus on the Vedas, Europe for 1,000 years on Aristotle, Spain on Cervantes and the Chronicles of the Cid, Bohemia on a single history, and Snorro Sturluson is alone the Norse history. A nation will subsist for centuries on one thought, and then every individual will be oppressed by the rush of ideas, and always a plenum with 1 grain or 60 atmospheres. August 11th. At Amherst, the learned professors in the parlor were pleased that the plurality of worlds was disproved, as that restored its lost dignity to the race of men, and made the old Christian immortality valid again and probable. I said this was a poor mechanical elevation, and all true elevation must consist in a new and finer possession, by dint of finer organization in the same things in which buffalo and fox had already a brutish and Indian and Paddy a semi-brute possession. Bub Dodington's book is the bare story of courtier servility, all atmosphere or music of honor quite left out. 'Tis butcher's meat, nothing more. 'Tis the result of aristocracy that its distinctions are now shared by the whole middle class. The road which grandeur levelled for its coach, toil can travel in its cart. Latin and Greek and algebra are now cheap. 'Tis the London Times that now keeps the poets and the chemist, and not John of Gaunt or Lord Dorset any longer. Mr. Bellow told me that Thackeray told him that he had employed Mr. Hannah to write up for him lectures on the wits of Queen Anne, which Thackeray had undertaken to read in America. Hannah has since produced for himself lectures on the satirists, but no Thackeray has been found to give them fame. August 27th. Sidney Smith found, as he grew older, men were better and foolisher than he had believed. The melioration in pears or in sheep and horses is the only hint we have that suggests the creation of man. Everything has a family likeness to him. All natural history, from the first fossil, points at him. The resemblances approach very near in the satyr to the Negro or lowest man, and food, climate, and concurrence of happy stars, a guided fortune, will have at last piloted the poor quadrumanus over the awful bar that separates the fixed beast from the versatile man. In no other direction have we any hint of the modus in which the infant man could be preserved. The fixity or unpassableness or inconvertibility of races as we see them is a feeble argument, since all the historical period is but a point to the duration in which nature was wrought. Any the least and solitariest fact in our natural history has the worth of a power and the opportunity of geological periods. All our apples came from the little crab. Illusions, horse chestnuts. In this gale of warring elements, it was necessary to bind souls to human life, as mariners in a tempest lash themselves to the mast and bulwarks of a ship. So nature employed certain illusions as her ties and straps. A rattle, a red coral, a doll, an apple, a horse chestnut, for a child keeps him going, climbing and tumbling about, and educates his muscle, blood, and bones. Skates a river, a boat, a horse, a gun, the boy, esprit du corps, party spirit, and maids draw the youth, money and power and his children the man. Slowly and rarely and condescendingly the masking veil falls, and he is allowed to see that all is one stuff, cooked and painted under 100 counterfeit appearances. When the boys come into my yards for leave to gather the horse chestnuts, I enter into nature's game and affect to grant the permission reluctantly, fearing that any moment they will find out they are fooled. Intellect. One of the phrases which Graves, I believe, uses, I think particularly descriptive of inspiration, the newness. Open the uncommanded doors, whence the newness comes, and I truly live. Eyes that the beam celestial view, which evermore makes all things new. Cable. England. Landor is a Plutarch again, and there is always a spiritual minority. Thus, in the Age of Bronze appeared Wordsworth and Coleridge, and now Wilkinson and Carlyle, and earlier Thomas Taylor. Their skepticism is perfectly impious. Certain conclusions of their science lasting, as Newton's refractions, fits of easy reflection and transmission, Leslie's latent heat, Dalton's atoms, Bradley's aberration of light and nutation of the earth's axis. The universities are wearisome old fogies, and very stupid with their aorists and alcaics and digammas. But they do teach what they pretend to teach, and whether by private tutor or by lecturer or by examiner, with prizes and scholarships, they learn to read better and to write better than we do. Editor's note. Although no word of trouble appears in the journal, the year had been a hard one for Mr. Emerson in other respects than the toilsome lecturing afar for a livelihood. In May, a suit was brought against him by a neighbor who claimed that a considerable portion of the tract of woodland beyond Walden, on the Lincoln side, which Mr. Emerson had bought a few years before from the two other neighbors, belonged to him by an old deed which he had discovered. The case was tried, and Mr. Emerson lost the part of the woods in question, much to his regret, but the pecuniary loss came to those who inadvertently sold him more land than they owned. By the advice of a valued and loyal friend, Mr. Emerson had made some investments in the Erie and Mad River, and also in the Vermont and Canada and Rutland's railroads. In summer, his letters show that the former began to appear doubtful, and in September no dividends came for the latter, and for several years thereafter his income was much reduced. It is due to the honored memory of his old friend Mr. Abel Adams to record that he insisted upon bearing the expenses of the college course of Mr. Emerson's son Edward a few years later in the hard times of the Civil War, and also made a bequest to Mr. Emerson and his children. End of note. October 4th. Wide the gulf between genius and talent. The men we know deal with their thoughts as jewelers with jewels which they sell but must not wear. Like carpenters with houses too fine for such as they to live in, the mystic is as good as his gold and jewels, good as his house that he builds, goes always in purple apparel, a glittering angel. October 9th. Sent Chapter 1 of English Traits to Phillips, Sampson and Company. At the Albion Hotel, we found that Mr. W.'s mushrooms tasted, quote, like the roof of a house, end quote. Trebellius, one of the 5 writers of the Augustan history in the 4th century, says, and then there's a quotation in Latin, and see the identity of traits between the French and the ancient Gauls in article Julius Caesar, Biographie Generale. Colleges should have a real examination or test before granting diplomas, as by competition for valuable prizes, so having rivals or enemies to adjudicate the crown, and this will come to be suggested and enforced by the neighborhood of the race course at Cambridge, by the pugilistic prize fights, by regattas and cattle shows. A fair mode is to propose problems, chemical, mathematical, and botanical, never yet solved, and rewards for the solution. The old custom of defending a thesis against all comers was a fair test, when there were comers. Time was when we built castles in the air. Of the American College, Alston, Greenough, Nuttall, Audubon, Fremont, Irving were to fill the chairs. God forbid I should complain of being excluded by this or that man or circle from this or that privilege. On the contrary, the most absolute submission on my part attends it. For do I not know that these parties are all eager to invite high merit to this privilege, and that on the instant when that merit is demonstrated by me or by any, they will fly to greet it, and will open every door to it, and bear it on their arms with joy unfeigned? Skepticism, yes, but a saint is a skeptic once in 24 hours. The House of Commons sits frequently 14, 15, and even 16 hours, whilst, quote, it has been observed by an irreverent wit that the Lord sits scarcely long enough to boil an egg, end quote. Edinburgh Review, January 1854. Till at length the time arrives when, in the words of Sir F. Baring, quote, any man who occupies the time of the House is a public enemy, end quote. The Charitable Trusts Bill, proposed by Lord Brougham in 1816, has at length become a law in 1853, and Lord John Russell said that this was about the ordinary period for bringing any considerable measure to maturity. English have more constitution than other people. Our John Marshall was a good specimen of that vigor. So much blood he did not know what to do with it, drank vast quantities of brandy like water, spent quantities of strength on swimming, hunting, riding, walking, and ready for the most absurd frolics with the gravity of the Eumenides. Mr. Blanchard, the carpenter in Concord, reading in the newspaper the sale of building lots on Lake Street in Chicago, quote, can't hardly believe that any lands can be worth so much money, so far off, end quote. December. A footnote says, on the edge of a severe winter, Mr. Emerson set forth to lecture before lyceums in the raw cities and towns of the then far West. The radiation of manners. The boundless America gives opportunity as wide as the morning, and the effects is to change the peak of the mountain into a vast tableland, where millions can share the privilege of this handful of patricians. LeClaire House, Davenport, Iowa, December 31st. Rules of the House. Quote, no gentleman permitted to sit at the table without his coat, end quote. Quote, no gambling permitted in the house, end quote. I have crossed the Mississippi on foot 3 times. Soft coal, which comes to Rock Island from about 12 miles, sells for 16 cents a bushel. Wood at $6 per cord. They talk quarter sections. I will take a quarter section of that pie. Leclaire, being a half-breed of the Sacs and Foxes, and a French Canadian, had a right to a location of a square mile of land, and with a more than Indian sagacity of choosing his warpath, he chose his lot, one above the rapids and the other below the rapids at Rock Island. He chose his lot 30 years ago, and now the railroad to the Pacific runs directly through his log house, which is occupied by the company for wood and other purposes. His property has risen to the value of $500,000 or $600,000. He is 57 years old and weighs 308 pounds. December 31st. In Rock Island, I am advertised as, quote, the celebrated metaphysician, end quote, in Davenport as, quote, the essayist and poet, end quote. This is the end of Emerson's journal collection number 46, dating from the year 1855, when the author was 52 years old. This is also the end of Volume 8. Thank you for listening.